The moment you felt powerless wasn't when they insulted you. It was when you replied, and you know it. Not because what you said was wrong, but because you said anything at all. Because you gave them the one thing they didn't deserve, proof they mattered. You kept your tone calm. You explained. You clarified. You wanted them to understand. But you didn't understand what that moment really was. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a disagreement. It was a test, a weighing, a silent measurement of who would fold first. And you did, not with emotion, not with anger, but with the need to be seen. They said something disrespectful and you walked into it like a trap wired with your own need to correct the narrative. You let your sense of justice do their dirty work for them. See, there's a trick to control, and it doesn't come from your mouth. It comes from what you're willing to let die in silence. Control is not what you say, it's what you withhold. The urge to explain, the need to be liked, the impulse to respond. That silence they fear, it's not awkward. It's power they can't negotiate with. They called you cold? That's because you stopped bleeding for their approval. They said you changed? That's because you stopped giving them free access to your emotional bandwidth. And they're right. You're not warm anymore, because warmth was mistaken for weakness in that room too many times. You watched people smile as they drained you dry. You don't have to say a word. You just have to stop reacting like you need to. You don't have to win arguments. You just have to stop entering battles you never respected. You don't have to assert dominance. You just have to sit still long enough for them to wonder what you already know. Control begins where desperation ends. But you'll only understand that when silence stops feeling like loneliness and starts feeling like leverage. If that hit subscribe. Or don't. Power doesn't beg for attention. They'll try to provoke you, not because they want truth, but because they want movement, reaction, noise, any sign that you're still controllable, any flicker of heat they can drag you back into. And the second you bite, even subtly, the power shifts, not in the blow, in the flinch, because the one who controls the tempo controls the terms. And if they can get you to defend yourself, they've already made the accusation stick. If they can get you to explain, they've already made your authority negotiable. And if they can get you to prove your value, they've already convinced you that it was in question. You think control is presence. It's not. It's restraint so complete, it turns the room against itself. The silence that makes people doubt what they just said. The stillness that makes their confidence trip over its own volume. The expression that doesn't flinch even when they throw fire to see if you'll burn. That's Machiavellian, because when you don't play defense, they lose their offense. When you don't react, they start wondering what you're calculating. And when you withhold even your anger, you become something they can't figure out, which means they can't control you. You want to dominate a conversation? Don't interrupt. Don't overpower. Don't outspeak. Out-silence. Let their words echo unanswered. Let their questions hang uninvited. Let their energy collapse into the vacuum you create. You'll see them shift, fidget, repeat themselves. They'll get louder, but not stronger, because nothing is more unnerving than someone who refuses to dance. And no, you're not being passive. You're starving the game of oxygen. Because the moment you stop feeding the dynamic, you don't just stop the game. You end it. Control isn't posture. It's refusal. And when you learn how to carry that refusal like a weapon, not with arrogance, not with ego, but with surgical stillness, you'll see people unravel. Because the loudest people are never loud because they're sure. They're loud because they're afraid you might be. And when you say nothing, you confirm their fear without saying a word. Most people don't speak to be understood. They speak to remain in control. That's the part no one tells you. Every word, every tone, every subtle pause in a conversation is a power move disguised as personality. And if you're not watching for it, you'll mistake manipulation for charm, dominance for charisma, and weakness for vulnerability. They'll play the victim just to control how guilty you feel. They'll ask innocent questions designed to corner you. They'll flatter you, not to uplift you, but to anchor your need for more. And you'll talk. You'll explain. You'll answer. Because you were raised to believe that communication builds connection. It doesn't. Not in rooms that feed off your openness. Here's the truth. You don't need to be more articulate. You need to be less available. Because the moment you start seeing words as currency, you'll stop giving them away to people who only want to spend them against you. Watch closely. They interrupt you not because they're passionate, but because your voice made them feel irrelevant. They ask what you really meant, not to understand, but to disarm. They suddenly go quiet after you speak, not because they're hurt, but because they want you to panic and start unraveling everything you just said. It's not chaos, it's choreography. And the only way to break it is to stop playing your part. When someone asks a question laced with bait, let it sit. When someone misinterprets you on purpose, stay silent. When someone accuses you without grounds, look at them like you're watching a storm pass from inside a locked room. Unbothered, dry, silent. That's when they lose their grip. Because people don't fear being wrong, they fear being unreadable. They want a face to interpret, a tone to decipher, a cue to react to. You take that away, you take their control. The strongest people in the room are never the ones who speak with power. They're the ones who make others question theirs. No raised voice, no clever comeback, just a presence so undisturbed that it forces others to sit with the weight of their own noise. And when they do, they talk themselves into defeat. They call it emotional intelligence. But it's not intelligence they fear, it's emotional discipline. Because the one who can feel everything, but chooses not to react, that's the one you don't provoke. See, most people aren't trying to win the conversation. They're trying to move you. If they can irritate you, you're reactive. If they can confuse you, you're destabilized. If they can flatter you, you're pliable. So when you stay centered, when nothing gets in, and nothing leaks out, they're not just unsettled. They're exposed. Because your stillness doesn't just protect you, it reveals them. It shows who's posturing, who's desperate to be agreed with, who's addicted to validation disguised as conversation. You say nothing, and they fill the silence with their own insecurity. And when you stop trying to be likable, you become dangerous. Because now they can't predict you. Now they can't guilt you. Now they can't bait you into softening their self-perception. You're not cold. You're exact. You listen to what's not being said. You hear the power plays behind the compliments. You watch for the delay before they answer, the eye shift before the fake laugh, the just kidding after the insult. You speak only when it adds weight. You pause not for effect, but for calculation. And when you finally say something, it lands, not because it's loud, not because it's long, but because it's earned. Machiavelli said it. The wise man does at once what the fool does at last. Control isn't about dominating others. It's about mastering your own emotional economy so precisely that no one can buy your reaction, no matter how much noise they make. And when you carry that unreadable calm, that quiet edge, you don't have to control the conversation. You become the one everyone's trying to read. The most powerful person in any conversation is the one least afraid of silence. Because silence is the only language that can't be manipulated. Words can be twisted. Tone can be misread. Meaning can be projected, reframed, edited in real time. But silence? It forces people to sit with themselves. And that's where their lies start to suffocate. Watch what happens when you stop filling in the blanks. When you stop rushing to make them comfortable. When you let their words dangle without a nod, without a laugh, without a soft little, "I get it." They'll talk more, then too much. Because most people talk to cover up their own tension. But when you don't meet them halfway, that tension turns inward. They start exposing things they never meant to reveal. You didn't control them. You controlled yourself. And that's what broke them open. That's what the manipulative ones never prepare for. A target that doesn't flinch. a mirror that doesn't react, a presence that doesn't collapse under pressure. You want to own a conversation? Say less. Mean more. Don't speak to be liked. Speak like your words cost something because they do. And if someone hasn't earned your clarity, they haven't earned your attention. Not every conversation deserves closure. Not every insult deserves a reply. Not every passive-aggressive comment deserves to be dignified with awareness. Sometimes the most brutal response is none. That's what they can't handle when you stay icy, precise, immovable. When you let them wonder, let them spiral. Let them replay it over and over, trying to decode what you meant by nothing. Because once they're the one doing all the interpreting, all the guessing, all the decoding, they're not in control anymore. You are, quietly, completely. And you didn't have to raise your voice to get there. You just stopped lowering your standard. You've probably noticed it by now. That shift in energy when you stop rushing to respond. The way people start stumbling when your face doesn't tell them what to feel. How they begin to self-correct, not because you demanded it, but because your silence forced them to hear themselves. That's not coincidence. That's leverage. See, most conversations aren't about words. They're about permission. They're asking, can I get a reaction out of you? Can I make you explain yourself? Can I pull you into my emotional chaos and call it connection? And most people say yes. Without knowing it, they defend their intentions. They soften their truth. They dilute their presence to stay understood. But there's a darker truth. If they can understand you too easily, they can undermine you just as easily. Predictable, transparent, exposed. That's why power doesn't explain. It observes. You watch the way their voice shifts when challenged. You notice how their confidence spikes when yours shrinks. You catch the rhythm, how they speak faster when they feel in control, how they joke more when they're hiding something, how they pause longer when they're lying. And you say nothing. Not to be mysterious, but because stillness gives you more intel than any answer ever could. That's how you take control without appearing to. By becoming the person they can't read and can't stop trying to. You don't win by dominating. You win by becoming the environment. When you hold your frame, not aggressively, not defensively, but with calm certainty, they start bending around it. They measure their words more. They watch your face for clues. They start performing for you. And when you realize this, you'll stop wasting energy trying to be heard and start choosing who's even worth listening to. Because at a certain level, it's not about saying the right thing. It's about becoming the kind of presence that makes people question whether they should have spoken at all. There's a moment you reach when their tactics stop working, not because they've changed, but because you did. You stopped needing to be perceived as kind. You stopped needing the benefit of the doubt. You stopped needing to walk out of every room with your image intact. And that's when everything shifted. Now, when someone accuses you, you don't flinch. When they go quiet to punish you, you let them drown in their silence. When they fish for reassurance, you look at them like you've already done the math and decided they're not worth solving. This isn't arrogance. This is what happens when self-respect outgrows your social programming. You're not rude. You're clean. You don't tolerate bait. You don't reward bad behavior. You don't keep dirty hands in your life just because they mean well. And when they realize that, they panic. Because they can't guilt you anymore. They can't get a rise out of you. They can't trap you in a conversation built to make you small. You're too still. Unreadable. Too strategic. They'll say you've become distant, cold, different. And you have. You no longer speak to be safe. You speak when it serves your vision. You don't text back to avoid tension. You let people feel what they made. You don't defend your silence. Because silence doesn't need defense. It is the defense. And when they sit across from you now, trying to figure out what happened, they'll realize you didn't change. You just stopped offering explanations to people who were never listening anyway. You stopped filling in the gaps for people who kept rewriting your truth. You stopped pouring energy into conversations where the outcome was already rigged. Now they talk, and you decide. Do they get a response? Do they earn access? Do they even qualify for the truth? Because when you've mastered restraint, you control the gates, and nothing scares people more than being shut out by someone who used to bleed for their attention. Eventually, it clicks. That control isn't about power over others. It's about being untouchable where it counts, unshakable when they test you, unreadable when they study you, unreachable when they try to drag you back into the roles you outgrew, because there's a cost to your peace now, and most people can't afford it. You see, when you were younger, you thought connection meant access. You let people in too fast, too deep, too often. You mistook attention for interest, affection for respect, noise for closeness. You let the loudest voice dictate the tempo. You let guilt masquerade as love. You let weakness dress up as vulnerability and gave it empathy it never earned. But now you let people talk, and you listen with surgical indifference. Not because you don't care, but because you finally learned the difference between someone speaking to connect and someone speaking to manipulate. You spot the emotional traps before they're laid. You feel the imbalance behind the question. You sense the transaction underneath the compliment. And you give nothing, because real power isn't in what you offer. It's in what you refuse to trade. You don't trade your peace for someone else's validation. You don't trade your truth for someone else's comfort. You don't trade your presence for someone else's chaos. And when they realize you're not reacting, not flinching, not folding, they don't just get quiet. They start adjusting, because your silence isn't empty. It's loaded, with consequence, with calculation, with control. You used to speak to keep the peace. Now you hold your peace to keep your power. You used to explain to avoid being misunderstood. Now you let them misunderstand because their version of you was never your problem. And when you finally step into that version of yourself, the one who doesn't chase closure, the one who doesn't hand out clarity to those who only weaponize it, that's when you stop being someone they talk at and start being someone they fear disappointing. That's control. Control has nothing to do with volume. It's the precision of your silence that makes people sweat. Because silence doesn't confirm. It doesn't deny. It leaves them in the void where every insecurity echoes louder than your voice ever could. That's the art. You don't force presence. You remove it. You take your energy out of the room and suddenly the room starves, because it was never about the conversation. It was about access to your reaction. And when that door closes, they're left talking to themselves. They replay every word. They second-guess their tone. They spiral, not because you hurt them, but because you didn't respond. No closure. No validation. No counterpunch. Just the sound of their manipulation collapsing under its own weight. That's why restraint is violent to the insecure. Because it starves the cycle. And they were never after truth, they were after control, disguised as dialogue. You used to play that game. You used to feel responsible for explaining yourself to people who'd already decided who you were. You used to keep conversations alive out of politeness, guilt, habit. But now you understand the weapon of indifference. Now you sit across from chaos and feel nothing. You watch the storm. You count its patterns. You wait for it to exhaust itself. Then you walk away dry, intact, unchanged, because nothing they say deserves to change your temperature. You're not distant. You're focused. You're not cold. You're exact. You're not quiet. You're calculating what silence will do that your words never could. And the deeper you sink into that, the fewer people you'll have to walk away from, because most won't even approach you anymore. They'll feel it. That they can't run their usual playbook with you, that they'll have to come correct, that you don't tolerate theater dressed as conversation, and if they don't know how to speak with truth, weight, respect, then they'll speak somewhere else, not because you forced them out, but because your presence made their performance impossible. By the time they realize you're not speaking, it's already too late. They've exposed themselves. They've filled the silence with projection. They've shown their hand every insecurity, every tactic, every weak attempt at control. And you're still. Not because you're suppressing anything, but because you've refined the violence of self-restraint into an art form. They can't argue with you, there's nothing to grip. They can't guilt you, your conscience is clean. They can't confuse you because you've stopped needing their version of events. This is what unnerves people. Not your words, not your position, but your refusal to be moved. Because once you've detached from the need to explain yourself, there's nothing left for them to leverage. They can scream, they can cry, they can accuse, joke, mock, flatter, but they won't reach you. And they know it. That's the moment they'll call you heartless. They'll say you're disconnected, cold, void of empathy, because they've confused your silence for absence when really, it's a boundary sharper than anything you could say. You're not withholding to be cruel. You're withholding because you finally understand what your words are worth. You're not ignoring them. You're letting the noise die out so truth can stand alone, undisguised by drama. You're not afraid to speak. You're simply no longer addicted to being heard. And that's what makes them crack. Because most people aren't searching for conversation. They're searching for confirmation of their power, of their role, of their control over your emotional state. Take that away, and the mask falls. So now you don't just own the room. You own the space between words. You own the pulse behind their eyes. You own the tempo without ever touching the volume. Not because you dominate, but because you don't need to. You've made peace with being misunderstood. You've divorced your identity from their reaction. You've chosen clarity over comfort, and now they have to confront themselves without you softening the mirror. That's the trick Machiavelli never said out loud. Real power doesn't chase influence. It cultivates such an untouchable inner world that others begin to orbit in response. You don't chase control, you become it. You don't realize how much you've given away until you stop speaking. How many times you've bent your truth to keep someone else from feeling small. How many times you've explained yourself to people who already made up their mind. How often you've lowered your voice just so someone else could feel taller. And for what? To be tolerated? To avoid conflict? To keep peace in rooms that would burn you just to stay warm? That version of you is dead. The one who tried to talk it out. The one who filled the silence with kindness, hoping it would be returned. The one who thought being understood was the path to being respected. You don't need understanding. You need range. The ability to go cold when warmth becomes weakness. The ability to disappear mid-conversation and sleep like a stone. The ability to starve chaos of your energy not because you're scared, but because you're beyond it. Control isn't about being feared. It's about being unavailable to manipulation. It's the look in your eye that says, I heard you. I just don't care enough to clarify. It's the silence after their outburst where they expect a reaction and get a stillness that makes them question if they ever mattered. It's the moment they realize they no longer have the power to shake you because you stopped needing anything they can offer. You don't fight for dignity anymore. You embody it. You don't argue to be respected. You exit. You don't speak to soothe discomfort. You let people sit in the consequences of their own emotional immaturity. And when they call you cold, you smile, because you know what that word really means. You stopped making your warmth available to the ungrateful lastly. Let them call it ego. Let them call it pride. They're just labeling what they can't manipulate. And that is the highest form of control you'll ever have. If it hit, comment what line stayed with you. Or don't. Real ones never beg to be seen.